How's your hammer, everybody? I'm PTDevil, and welcome to another episode of The Deck Doctors. In this series, we'll be looking at some of the most unplayable archetypes in the whole game, figuring out why they're so bad, and designing some new support to help make them playable. The process we'll be using is examining what it is they do, diagnosing what their problems are, and prescribing a treatment for them to be less awful. With all that said, let's get to the video. You know, it's been a while since I've drunk from this plot well. I think it's about time I started ripping off Rada again. Here we have Reptilianne, an archetype of snake ladies used by a cheap throwaway character from 5Ds in a grand total of 1.5 duels, so nobody really cared when she disappeared into an ancient geoglyph. Man, that series was weird. They seem to be focused on absolute attack manipulation and control effects regarding monsters with zero attack, but apparently the people in charge of designing them seem to have missed the memo on that since they kinda suck in that regard. They're a synchro archetype, but not only do they only have one synchro to their name, but they struggled to get even that onto the field due to their inability to provide the resources for it. I'm already well behind schedule for this episode, so let's just skip the pleasantries and jump right in, shall we? We start the review with Reptilianne Naga, a level 1 dark reptile with 0 attack and defense, cannot be destroyed by battle, and any monster that battles this card has its attack reduced to 0 at the end of the battle phase. However, if this card is in face-up defense position, change it to attack position during your end phase. As I mentioned before, this archetype is focused on absolute attack reduction, specifically with control effects related to monsters with 0 attack. Despite this, Naga was their most reliable method of doing so for the longest time, and still remains a staple card in the archetype to this day for being able to stick around and zero out the attack of several monsters. Setting Naga and letting your opponent try to crash into it used to be a decent first turn play back in the day before non-battle removal became so incredibly common that this card would now be taken care of long before the battle phase. And even if it does manage to stick around, the fact that it locks itself into attack position means you're going to be taking a crap ton of damage while it does its thing, which the archetype really can't afford to do on that high of a level, without using damage equals reptile to recur advantage through said damage, or even spirit barrier to circumvent said damage in the first place. Both of which are unsearchable continuous traps, so that's far from a reliable strategy for the deck to use consistently. Still, the archetype needs all the attack reduction it can get, so feel free to max out on this one solely due to a complete lack of options. So while Naga sets up the theme for the archetype and gives a basis for how the deck is supposed to function, dragging you back into the land of confusion is Reptilianne's Servant, another level 1 with 100 attack and defense. And neither player can normal summon while this card is face up on the field, but it blows itself up if there are any other face up monsters on the field, or if it's targeted by the effect of a spell or trap card. So to recap, it's a low-level non-tuner in a synchro archetype, and even if it were a tuner, it couldn't be used for a synchro summon because it blows itself up if you dare to control another face-up monster. It blocks the opponent from normal summoning, but a lot of decks these days, especially top decks like Shadal's and Adamancipators, don't need the normal that much since they have the ability to, and indeed do, inherently special summon without it, meaning that this card will still blow itself up regardless. Even back when this card came out, it didn't do anything since it didn't prevent setting or flip summoning either, so your opponent would still be able to take care of it easily by letting it blow itself up. I might have considered this card despite all of this if you could use it as a destruction trigger for other effects, but the archetype has no effects whatsoever that would benefit from this card blowing itself up. Basically, there's no way to take advantage of the stun effect because it constantly blows itself up too easily, and there's no way to benefit from this card blowing itself up, so you can't even run it for the specific purpose of letting it blow itself up. Also, take a shot every time I just said blow itself up, and you'll need to call an ambulance before you get halfway through this paragraph. Anyway, don't run this card. Reptilianne Viper is their first tuner, a level 2 with 0 attack and defense, a piece of cloth to cover the neck private parts for some reason. And when it's normal summoned, you can target and take control of a face-up monster the opponent controls with 0 attack. This would be one of the aforementioned control effects regarding monsters with zero attack, in this case quite literally a control effect since it can just straight up steal a monster the opponent controls. The fact that it only triggers on the normal summon is incredibly annoying since it then requires a lot of setup in order to pull off this effect, because if the opponent just so happens to have no targets for this card to steal, it will do absolutely nothing of consequence. Still, it's not like the deck has any better options regarding control effects, so feel free to treat yourself to 2 or 3 of these. The next monster is Reptilianne Lamia, another tuner with the exact same level and stats, and the following effect. If this card is in your hand and all monsters you control are face-up reptile type monsters, minimum 1, you can target one face-up monster your opponent controls, change its attack to 0, and if you do, special summon this card, then take damage equal to that monster's original attack. If this card is sent to the graveyard as synchro material, you can target up to 2 face-up monsters on the field, change their attack to 0. You can only use 1 Reptilianne Lamia effect per turn and only once that turn. As you may have guessed by the 6 miles of card text, this is a recent addition to the archetype, being a whopping year and 11 days old in the OCG. Assuming this video goes up on time, which by this point I can almost guarantee you it's not. I still remember when this card was first announced and people were excited to see if this meant that Reptiliannes were getting a new wave of modern support that would make them playable and that they wanted to see what kind of fun things they could try with them. Sadly, however, that never happened, since aside from this card, the only new support they got was their new Link monster, which wasn't to come out for another 7.5 months after this one. Still, in terms of sheer versatility, this is by far the best monster in the archetype, mainly by virtue of none of the others having any by this point. The summon effect is literally the only swarm effect in the entire archetype, which is frankly pathetic for a synchro archetype. And it even zeroes out a monster on the opponent's field while it does so, allowing you to take advantage of other Reptilian effects such as Viper. Sure, you're taking a whole lot of damage while doing so, but the same also applies to Naga as well, and at the very least it's only 1 hit as opposed to a lot with the latter. However, if you do manage to get this onto the field by other means and synchro summon with this, you get a much better attack reduction effect, which is especially handy when you look at their archetypal synchro. All in all, I wouldn't say she's my favorite Lamia because, well, you know, but she's definitely good enough to be up there at least. Make sure to run 3 of these. The next monster is Reptilianne Gorgon. I smell an anime card, let me check. Yep, that's an anime card, alright. Seriously, would it have killed the card design team to update the artwork a little bit first? Or at the very least make the others look similar in order for it to not look so horrifically out of place? Well, anyway, it's a level 3 with 1400 attack and defense, and if it attacks a monster, the attack of that monster becomes 0 after damage calculation. Also, it cannot change its battle position. The keyword here being after damage calculation. In other words, as the greatest minds in Arc 5 once told us, you still take the damage! As if that wasn't bad enough, you can't even set this card and wait for your opponent to run it over since it needs to be specifically attacking in order for its effect to go off. So you have to actively crash it into things, lose a resource in the process, and pray to Halakti that you still have something that can take advantage of that 0 attack monster that you wasted your effort to make. Furthermore, the level of this monster is an awkward one for the archetype to work with considering what they need to be working toward. Despite this, it's still arguably worth running since relying solely on Naga and Lamia for attack reduction is not only unnecessarily restrictive, but also extremely damage heavy, which can get a bit much for this deck. Even still, I wouldn't run more than 1. The next monster is Reptilianne Gardna, looking somehow even more cartoonish than the last one, which I frankly didn't think was possible. It's a level 4 water attribute? With 0 attack and 2000 defense, and when it's destroyed and sent to the graveyard, you can add 1 Reptilianne monster from your deck to your hand. Honestly, the worst thing I can say about it is that it's a water attribute, which makes what would otherwise be excellent outside support like Allure and Wee Witch Apprentice a bit inconsistent. Not only does this card have 0 attack, meaning that it synergizes with the theme of the deck, but the search effect goes up whether it's destroyed by battle or card effects, including your own card effects. But between this and Servant, I'm pretty sure that they meant for this deck to have some sort of destruction synergy, which they somehow forgot to include in the archetype itself. Regardless, this is the only searcher the deck has, which is kind of annoying since it only searches the monsters. But nevertheless, you might as well run 3. Next up is Reptilianne Scylla, another level 4, this time a dark like Halakdi intended. It's got 1800 attack and 1200 defense, and if it destroys an opponent's monster with 0 attack by battle, you can special summon that monster from their graveyard to your field in defense position, but it has its effects negated. An archetypal Goyo Guardian sounds like a great idea in theory, but in practice this card falls short of the utility of her little sister, Reptilianne Viper. Viper steals a monster outside of the battle phase, is a tuner so that it can potentially use what it steals for synchro plays, and it even has the 0 attacks to synergize with the deck. Now that doesn't mean there's no reason to run this. It does have an easy 1800 attack on a level 4, which is an impressive attack spread in this archetype. And since it's a level 4 non-tuner, it's extremely handy for making their synchro plays for a reason that will become obvious when we get to said synchro. I would personally say run 2 just for a sheer lack of options. Now asking the real questions, which of these mouths leads to the anus? Reptilianne Medusa, which is a contender for ugliest son of a bitch in the entire game, and that's saying a lot for a game which includes Ojamas, is a level 6 with 2200 attack and 800 defense, and you can send 1 card from your hand to the graveyard to target a monster the opponent controls to 0 out its attack and prevent it from changing its battle position. The fact that the effect requires a discard can be a bit much at first, but considering the boss monsters of the archetype, it should be something that it can handle, at least theoretically. The effect does target, but it compensates for this by not being a once per turn, so it can still have a lot of uses for you to go into bigger plays. All in all, this would actually be a decent card worth running in the deck, if it weren't for the fact that it's a goddamn tribute summon monster. As I mentioned earlier, there's no special summoning effects in the archetype outside of Lamia, so tribute fodder is very hard to come by aside from some very niche one-offs. And even if you do have the means to tribute summon this, the sheer brick potential of this card makes finding an acceptable ratio is all but impossible. If you run 1 Medusa, you're left waiting to draw into your 1 copy and end up missing the optimal window for summoning it. And if you run 2 or 3, you're left with a bunch of obese reptiles clogging up your hand, preventing you from getting the materials to summon it in the first place. In other words, it's far too much trouble than it's worth, so unless new support comes along that would make this easier to summon, I just wouldn't bother. The last main deck monster is Reptilianne Voski, a level 8 with 2600 attack and no defense, and it must be special summoned by tributing 2 monsters with 0 attack from either side of the field. Once per turn, you can target and destroy 1 monster the opponent controls for free, but there can only be 1 Reptilianne Voski on the field. Sure, the destruction effect targets and is therefore limited on what it can do, but the fact that it has no cost and is a soft once per turn means that you can get some utility out of it regardless. However, I really can't stress enough how much I love this summoning condition. This card is one of only 5 monsters in the entire game that can inherently special summon itself using only the opponent's monsters as material. It's far from the best of the lot since said list also includes Nibiru, but it's still very much appreciated. Of course, if your opponent doesn't have any 0 attack monsters, it can still be a bit cloggy, but at the very least it can take from your field if need be, so you can still find other ways to bring it to the field. Plus, with inherent access to non-targeting, non-destruction, tribute removal, Reptilians have a lot more versatility than the average deck doctor's patient. Run 2 or 3 of these. Their only synchro monster is Reptilianne Hydra, a level 6 with 2100 attack and 1500 defense, requires a Reptilianne tuner and 1 or more non-tuners, and when this card is synchro summoned, destroy all your opponent's monsters with 0 attack and draw 1 card for each one destroyed. Legally, I have to give props to any effect that lets you potentially go plus 14 in card advantage, but let's be honest, that perfect of a setup is never going to happen. It's gotten a bit better with the new support, but even then, the most you're going to get on a regular basis with this card is 2 or 3 draws of cards which generally won't be able to help you, considering you probably used both your normal summon and Lamia's special summon effect by this point. It could be used in order to replenish your hand after using Medusa's effect before summoning this card, which, all things considered, is probably the main intention. However, I must remind you that Medusa is a tribute summon monster, which the deck can barely get out in the first place, so that's not something that they're going to be able to do very often. Still, it's not like they're pressed for extra deck space, so feel free to run 1 or 2. Their last monster, which is also their newest piece of support altogether, is Reptilianne Echidna. It's a Link 2 with 200 attack and arrows pointing left and bottom right. It requires 2 monsters of material, of which one must be reptile type, and it has the following effect. If this card is Link summoned, you can target one face-up monster your opponent controls, change its attack to 0. During your main phase, if your opponent controls a monster with 0 attack, you can add reptile monsters with different names from your deck to your hand, up to the number of monsters your opponent controls with 0 attack. Also, you cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck for the rest of this turn, except reptile monsters. You can only use each effect of Reptilianne Echidna once per turn. Despite the odd arrows in an archetype with almost no revival options, once again this really should do a lot more than it actually does with the advantage it can generate. The materials are semi-generic, meaning that it's fairly easy to summon even with monsters you steal with Viper or Scylla. The simple attack reduction effect is a nice easy tool to have for this archetype and synergizes with her search effect, but the hard once per turn limits what it can actually accomplish. Speaking of which, the fact that the search effect is completely generic is exceptionally handy since it allows for teching in generic reptile support like Evil Dragon Ananta and Gentlemander, but also because, aside from Lamia, there's no real good target to search in the archetype itself since, again, you've likely used up the normal summon by this point. Finally, the fact that it locks you into reptiles could be argued as necessary considering the advantage it generates. But not only are said searches limited as mentioned before, but the lock is especially oppressive since it limits you to a grand total of 10 monsters, 4 of which are completely impossible for the deck to make, 3 are extremely difficult, and the only non-reptilian among the remaining is the alien Link monster of all things, which can come in handy more often than not, but like the archetype's own boss monsters, is hardly a reliable win condition on its own. Even looking through other Deck Doctors cards, the only one they add is Old Entity Yig, which does nothing for the deck other than maybe allowing it to run Super Poly. Though if you want a challenge, feel free to try making it in Reptilianne's to make Danger Kraken and go for Deck Doctors Bingo for some style points. Of course, because of the type lock, space in the extra deck is readily available, so 2 or 3 Echidna should be more than enough. Their first spell card is Reptilianne Spawn, a normal spell that lets you banish a Reptilianne monster from your graveyard to special summon 2 Reptilianne tokens to your side of the field. The tokens are level 1 Earth reptiles with 0 attack and defense. Honestly, I think I would have preferred it if it summons the tokens to the opponent's side of the field. Sure, it's basically an instant Echidna, and it can provide tribute fodder to clear up a Bricky Voski or Medusa even. But aside from that alien Link, there's not much else you can use these tokens for. They're too low of a level for synchro summoning, though it would make Hastur and Yig easier to summon. And they can't even be used for Link summoning other staple cards like Wee Witch since they're Earth monsters for some reason. Whereas if they were summoned to the opponent's field, it wouldn't be able to summon Echidna, but it would let you get an additional 2 searches off of her effect, of which can include cards like Lamia and Gentlemander, which can then be used to synchro summon Hydra in order to get an extra 2 draws. Alternatively, they can still be used to summon Voski even if they are on the opponent's field, so the intended use for them is still intact. Like I said, it's a useful card, but it could still be a lot better. Regardless, 2 or 3 should suffice. The next card is Reptilianne Poison. Activate only if you control a face-up Reptilianne monster. Change one defense position your opponent controls to face-up attack position and reduce its attack to 0. Setting aside the admittedly important fact that nobody places their monsters sideways anymore, isn't this what the Reptilians themselves are supposed to do? If they're going to be relying on unsearchable spell traps to get their attack reduction off, they might as well use cards that are better at doing so, or do other things while they're at it, like Ghost of a Grudge or Cubic Rebirth, respectively. That and the fact that Spawn can serve the same basic function as this card by making an instant Echidna to get an attack reduction effect off for free. The point is, don't play Reptilianne Poison. Viper's Rebirth is another one of those cards which technically don't fall within the archetype, but considering the artwork and intended use of this card, I decided that it counts. Activate only if all monsters in your graveyard are reptile type. Select one non-tuner monster in your graveyard and special summon it, but destroy it during the end phase. An archetypal monster reborn for 73% of the archetype is definitely something to be excited about, especially in an archetype with no other swarming options. But the exclusion of this card from the archetype leaves this card extremely limited on what it can do. Even if it were a part of the archetype, it would still be unsearchable, considering there's no way to search out back rows since all search effects in the archetype are limited only to monsters. Hydra's effect could help you dig through your deck to find these faster, but that's assuming you have the appropriate setup in order to draw a crapload of cards, which, as I mentioned, only happens about once every 15 heliocycles. However, it's still very much a necessary card for the archetype at the moment, so you can't do with any less than 3. The next card is Reptilianne Rage, an equipped spell that can be equipped to any monster, changes the equipped monster into a reptile, gives it 800 attack, and if this card is destroyed, you can target a monster the opponent controls to have it lose 800 attack. This one feels like halfway through designing it, they just stopped giving a shit, which seems to be a recurring theme of this series now that I think of it. Not only is this card completely unsearchable in the archetype, but the effects do absolutely nothing to benefit the deck since none of them have anything in common with any of the cards we've discussed thus far. Not only that, the fact that the card is completely generic tells me that this was never intended to be used in the deck to begin with, and it was just a crappy anime adaptation card that nobody bothered to update to match the archetype it was made for. The only thing I can think of using this for is to make monsters you steal from the opponent via Viper or Scylla into reptiles so that they can be used as link material for Echidna. But not only did this come out 10 years prior to Echidna, but her materials only require one reptile to make, which you definitely have since you used one to steal the monster in the first place. Don't run this thing even if your life depended on it. The last card in the archetype is Serpent Suppression. I know, I thought this was Venom support too, considering the lack of any Reptilians on the artwork. It's a continuous trap card that prevents attack position monsters your opponent controls with 0 attack from being destroyed by battle with Reptilian monsters. I get the idea, it's just that the idea is incredibly stupid. It's like they thought that Reptilianne beatdown was a legitimate strategy, so they needed a way to allow them to keep attacking into the opponent's 0 attack monsters to deal massive damage. However, not only are the Reptilianne monsters' attack values pathetically low as it is, but this card actively goes against some of the key effects in the archetype already, such as Scylla's Goyo Guardian effect. As a general rule of thumb, granting protection to your opponent is never a good idea, even when it's incredibly limited like this. Here's an example of a Reptilianne deck taking advantage of as much generic reptile support as it can. This is also the first deck profile made on EDO Pro, so that's one way this changeover made a lasting impression at least. Now, as for the diagnosis, we don't have a lot to talk about since I don't think this archetype needs any major changes. And instead they just need to keep going the way that they're going. First and foremost, some back row that would actually benefit the archetype would be appreciated, especially if they had a way to search out the relevant back row if needed. More control effects regarding monsters with 0 attack would be nice as well, since they have a clear game plan set up, but they need a way to take advantage of it as much as possible. Some more synchros are a must, since they are kind of embarrassingly lacking in regard for something that's supposedly a synchro archetype. And on a related note, they need some more swarming ability in order to make said synchros, since relying solely on Lamia and Viper's rebirth is nowhere near enough to make a board. Lastly, while the archetype is close to achieving perfection in their attack reduction, they just need a little bit more of a push in order to get where they need to be. And with that, we come to the prescription with a brand new contributor this time in the form of Kieran's girlfriend, who has a history with Reptiliannes. Though looking at her deck list, it's a tangential history at best, since less than 10% of this has anything to do with Reptiliannes, but that's good enough for me. We start off with Reptilianne Mansa, a level 4 with 1900 attack and no defense, and as a quick effect, you can discard one other Reptilianne monster to special summon this card from your hand in defense position. If this card is summoned, you can take control of one monster your opponent controls with 0 attack, but its effects are negated. You can only use each effect of Reptilianne Mansa once per turn. Sure, it's basically just Viper with a special summoning condition, but considering the sheer lack of them by this point, that's perfectly fine. It's not a tuner, so it can't use the stolen monsters as synchro material on its own, but it should be able to make Echidna fairly easily. There's also the fact that this is a quick effect, meaning that it could be used during the opponent's turn as a form of disruption, though since it summons itself in defense position with 0 defense, you will almost assuredly be losing this monster in the process. Still, it's a fantastic tool for the archetype, so you'll want to run 3 of these. Next up is Reptilianne Cybaris, a level 6 with 2000 attack and defense, and the following effect. If you control no monsters, you can special summon this card from your hand and change its attack to 0. You can reveal one Reptilianne tuner in your hand, decrease this card's level by that of the revealed monster. If this card is sent to the graveyard as synchro material for the synchro summon of a Reptilianne monster, you can target one other Reptilianne monster in your graveyard, special summon it, and change its attack to 0 until the end phase. You can only use each effect of Reptilianne Cybaris once per turn. If you open up this card in Lamia, you're pretty much set to make any level 6 synchros such as Hydra or the new one we'll get into later. It also has some recursion if you use it for the intended synchros, which means you could potentially get off both effects of Lamia, assuming you can protect it through the opponent's turn. Not impossible with the new support, but will still require some work. Either way, run 3. Their first new synchro is the long-lost cousin of Viper, Reptilianne Skink. An adorable level 4 tuner with 0 attack and 2000 defense, requires a Reptilianne tuner and one or more non-tuner monsters, and if this card is synchro summoned, you can target one monster your opponent controls, change its attack to 0, and if you do, take control of it until the end phase. When your opponent activates a spell or trap card or effect while this card is in the graveyard, quick effect, you can banish this card from your graveyard, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. You can only special summon and use each effect of Reptilianne Skink once per turn. As opposed to Mansa being a retrain of Viper, this one's just a straight up upgrade, which is understandable considering it's a synchro that's somewhat difficult for the archetype to make. It also has a graveyard effect where it can negate an opponent's spell trap by banishing itself, which doesn't even require it to be properly special summoned first. That being said, there's no way to freely dump it without an extra foolish burial, but at least it's there. Like I said, it's a bit tricky to summon without spawn, but doing so is still rewarding considering the effects. Run 1 or 2. The next monster is Reptilianne Uriel. Don't ask how I know to pronounce that, I just do. It's another level 6 with 2500 attack and 1200 defense, has the same materials as Skink and Hydra, and has the following effect. If this card is summoned, you can discard one reptile monster, special summon one Reptilianne monster from your deck. Then if it was a Reptilianne Medusa that was special summoned, you can add one tuner from your graveyard to your hand. You can only use this effect of Reptilianne Uriel once per turn. Negate the effects of your opponent's monsters with 0 attack. Special summoning from the deck is one of the best effects in the game, and this one is no exception. The fact that it can summon any Reptilianne means that it will always be available, but it also incentivizes you to use her little sister Medusa, since it also lets you recycle a tuner from your graveyard, of which you will have at least one since you used one to make this. Plus, the fact that the effect is generic incentivizes the use of hand traps, since you'll be able to use most of them more than once. Speaking of which, the stun effect is also handy to have on its own, since it's able to neutralize any monsters that got hit by the Reptilianne's attack reduction effects. but satisfyingly it also negates most of the opponent's hand traps as well. Though if you were able to get far enough to make a non-generic level 6 synchro, you probably won't have to worry about hand traps by this point anyway. Regardless, run 2. The last monster is Reptilianne Steno. It's a level 8 with 3000 attack and 2000 defense, has the inverse materials of the last 3, meaning 1 generic tuner and 1 or more non-tuner Reptiliannes. And if this card is synchro summoned, you can special summon 1 level 6 Reptilianne monster from your graveyard. You can tribute 1 monster with 0 attack from either side of the field, change the attack of all monsters your opponent controls to 0. You can only use each effect of Reptilianne Steno once per turn. While your opponent controls a monster with 0 attack, your opponent cannot target other Reptilianne monsters you control for attacks or by card effects. There can only be 1 face-up Reptilianne Steno on the field. Now that the archetype has an actual boss monster, this one is a pretty good win condition. It lets you recycle one of the level 6s, presumably the one you used to summon this thing to begin with, and it also has a mass attack reduction effect that can potentially tribute an opponent's monster as cost to do so. Speaking of which, because it also changes all the opponent's monsters' attacks to 0, it also provides fodder for Voski, meaning that you could tribute up to 3 monsters on the opponent's field at once. It also has some decent field protection, being able to keep your weaker monsters on the field so that they can actually use their effects. Make sure to run 1 or 2 of these. Their first new spell card is Reptilianne Pheromones. Discard 1 reptile monster, send 1 Reptilianne monster from the deck to the graveyard, and if you do, special summon 1 Reptilianne monster with a different name from your graveyard. You can only activate 1 Reptilianne Pheromones per turn. Simple swarming and graveyard setup on a normal spell are very much appreciated. There's not a whole lot the archetype can benefit from with the graveyard setup beyond Steno, but it will make a bit more sense when we get into the later support. Regardless, the fact that it can let you get an extra monster on board to continue making plays is more than enough to warrant running on its own. Run 3. Their new field spell is Reptilianne Stone Garden. During either player's turn, if a monster is summoned except a Reptilianne monster, change the attack of those monsters to 0 during the end phase. You can only use each of the following effects of Reptilianne Stone Garden once per turn. When this card is activated, you can add 1 Reptilianne spell trap from your deck to your hand except Reptilianne Stone Garden, and you can send 1 Reptilianne monster from your deck to the graveyard, special summon 1 Reptilianne token to your opponent's side of the field in defense position. This one basically doubles down on the attack reduction by affecting all monsters that are summoned while it's on the field. The negation window happens on the initial activation upon that monster's summon, so it forces your opponent to take extra steps to work around it or suffer the consequences. Also, because it affects your field as well, it forces the player to play the deck essentially pure to avoid shooting themselves in the foot. It only applies during the end phase though, so there's still a way for both you and the opponent to make use of high attack monsters until then, but it's still something that both players will have to keep in mind. There's also the fact that it searches most of the other back row cards on activation, and provides the opponent with a 0 attack token to use the Reptilianne's effect while dumping a monster as cost. Make sure to run 3 at all times. The last card is Reptilianne Petrification, a continuous trap with this effect. While your opponent controls a monster with 0 attack, your opponent cannot activate monster effects. If a Reptilianne monster would be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can banish 1 Reptilianne card from your graveyard instead. If this card on the field is destroyed by an opponent's card effect, your opponent cannot declare an attack during their next battle phase. Now the graveyard setup makes sense, as it's used to fuel this card's protection effect. It also extends the protection to the opponent's field as well, so you could use it to keep a Reptilianne token summoned by Stone Garden on the opponent's field, Lost World style. This is important since it also works as a one-sided skill drain for as long as the opponent controls a 0 attack monster, meaning that you'll want to keep one on there for as long as possible. The floating effect is there mainly for the benefit of the field spell's attack reduction effect to be able to resolve. Reducing all monsters to 0 doesn't do you much good if you get OTK'd before it can go off after all. The deck basically lives or dies by this card, so be sure to run 3 of these as well. And that should do it. I have a sneaking suspicion I might have overpowered them slightly, but until I can see this in action, I can't say for sure. At any rate, that's what Doctor's Notes is for anyway. With a lot of recent support coming out for plants, thunders, and even rocks, it's kinda sad to see that reptiles are pretty much the only type that is left without any competitive meta relevance to this day. I feel like Reptiliannes were the ones that got the closest, but they never got that final push they needed in order to make them viable. At the very least, we know that Konami hasn't forgotten about them quite yet, so hopefully they'll get some actual support real soon. In the meantime, we'll just have to settle for this to get some snake ladies into the game. Thank you guys so much for watching. It is now the day this video is scheduled to go up as I'm recording this, so this is definitely going to be a bit late, and I apologize for that. I swear to God, I'm gonna start putting emergency services on my resume after this. Regardless, thanks for watching, and until next time, don't get run over, and I'll see you guys later.